Hello, and welcome to the Ascendant Art Podcast. We are on a search for art that is ascending above the mainstream, and this time, this is our very first Ascendant Art stream, so we truly are doing it live. Tonight, we first, of course, have our co-hosts, Joey from Keeper's Cairn and Vinny from Little Chad. And for our guest tonight, we've got Alex from the publisher Cirsova. From what I know about them, they have a publication and they do a number of interesting written works. I just want to say, how are you doing tonight, sir?
Hey, I'm doing all right.
I've seen some of the writing contests for Cirsova. I know also I've started to follow about the Kickstarter you guys are doing. So tell me a little bit about your publication, what you guys do, how long you've been doing it.
All right. Well, we've got a quarterly magazine, Cirsova magazine of thrilling adventures and daring suspense. We've been doing it since 2016. We are what's called a semi-pro magazine, which means that we pay a per word rate. We don't just pay authors in free copies or a token. So somebody sends us a 10,000 word story, we cut them a check for $125 based on our rates.
Okay. So you publish it based on the amount written, and then also to now I realize too, I've been pronouncing it wrong the whole time. I keep saying Cirsova.
Fine.
Does Cirsova have a meaning?
Actually, it started out as a Dungeons and Dragons setting that I was working on because we kind of started out as a Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop RPG blog. But as I was getting
Ooh, now you're speaking my language.
as I was getting more interested in stuff like the Appendix N books and the fiction that inspired Dungeons and Dragons, when I was following along with Jeff Rose Johnson's blog and his work on Appendix N at Castalia House, I started getting into some of the old pulp magazines and found a whole bunch of Planet stories at a flea market. And I was like, wow, it'd be really fun to try putting out a magazine like this. I assumed that there were people who were still writing the kind of fiction that I enjoyed reading. It was just, you always hear that there's not an outlet for it. So I was like, I'll make an outlet for it.
One of the things I always love to hear is the person who they finally stopped saying like, hey, I've got this idea, but like he just went out and actually did it. And remind me again, how long you've been doing this?
I think going into our 6th year. I put out the first submission call in late 2015, put it all together, and our first issue dropped spring 2016. Got a Hugo nomination in 2017, and we've been putting them out between 2 to 5 issues a year ever since.
Okay. And I was going to say that very first time, I'm sure like it was probably kind of crazy, a lot of stuff on the learning curve. What were some of the things that you kind of ran into initially, or like what's some of the stuff you've been learning along the way?
The first issue was not as bad because we were a new publication, so we didn't get a whole lot of interest. But every submission period since, I mean, we've just got a deluge of stories. And so, like, one of the most time-consuming things is going through all of the stories that people send us. One of the reasons that we've ended up settling on a 1-week open submission period is that the last time we were open for a full month, we just got like 150 submissions. And so having to read through all of those, and really the worst part of being an editor is having to send out rejection letters to stories that you like. And so when you're getting 150 stories or over 200 stories sometimes, you're having to say no to a lot of good things that you don't want to have to say no to.
Because I'm sure it's one of those cases of like, man, like, okay, there's 200 of these, maybe 50 of them are really good, but you're like, man, I can only take 15 of them. So
I'm kind of known for overbuying, which is one of the reasons why a couple years ago we ended up putting out 5 issues in a year, which was a lot of work. And this year we've upped our content. We normally put out like 50,000 word issues. This year our 4 issues are 80,000 words because not only are we serializing Michael Tierney's newest Wild Stars novel, one of our colleagues who's a publisher of sword and sorcery, fantasy and science fiction, Dave Ritzlin, said, hey, I've got this work for you if you want to check it out. The only catch is that it's novel length. So, I mean, I wasn't going to pass up a chance on a novel by Dave Ritzlin just because I didn't have enough space. So we're serializing 2 novels this year instead of just the one. So, like I said, our issues are a lot thicker than they were in the past.
it doesn't fit. Now we'll just make it fit. We'll figure out how.
Pretty much.
Well, that's awesome because A lot of great sci-fi and fantasy that we look to today was serialized. I mean, I think The Hobbit was serialized.
Don't
All
know
of
about The Hobbit, but not Tarzan. Tarzan was actually running an entire issue, but later Tarzan stories were serialized. The John Carter stories were
Yeah, I think
serialized.
Robert E. Howard did a lot, did all
Uh,
most of his stuff, I think, in magazines and
well, most
serialized
most
forms.
of Howard's stuff was short fiction. I don't know that he had a whole lot of serialized novels, but yeah, there have been a lot of the greats who were in either All Story Weekly, Argosy, Weird Tales, Planet Stories, Thrilling Wonder, Startling Stories. Just some of the best fiction writers of the 20th century were in magazines.
Yeah, I think especially sci-fi like Asimov and was it Philip K. Dick and all those guys were pretty much magazine serial publishers. I'm definitely a fan of that. I think those kinds of spaces need to continue, and I'm glad that you're out there working it. That's awesome.
I was going to say, it's almost like one thing we're starting to see here, just on our podcast, with other creators we've been talking to, is something that often gets missed when people look at just the mainstream and they wonder, it's like, man, like, how do these people get so famous and just come out of nowhere? And in reality, like, there's this whole discovery engine out there. And so you're right, like, serial publications are one of those, social media is one, Kickstarter's one. And it's like, it's really this whole ecosystem of trial and discovery until you get a good, consistent creator. And on that note, have you seen like any projects that kind of like got their start with you guys and they're going off and doing their own thing now? Or tell me some about that.
We have a few writers who've done stuff like that. One of our big early names was Skylar Hernstrom. He writes some amazing sword and sorcery fantasy stuff. A lot of the stuff he's been doing now lately has been either for Pylum Press or for DMR Books, partly because he knows those guys in person, I think, and he's local to the Pittsburgh area, and so are they. But he kind of got his start. One of the cool things, though, that we managed to do is there was a 70s Sword and Planet series called The Dream Lords by Adrian Cole. And, I ended up hitting up Adrian Cole saying, would you be interested in writing more Dream Lords stories for us? And he said, sure. So he
Wow.
ended up sending in some more Dream Lord stories that we've published. And now he's putting out a fix-up novel of those stories out through, I think, Pulp Hero Press.
Nice. And also too, you mentioned you do a lot of fantasy. Now I know also like the first time I heard about you guys, it was Mark Pellegrini. He published a horror piece with you guys. What kind of publications or what kind of pieces do you take?
Go to their website and then ask
Yeah,
the question, what don't you take? That's where the fun is.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of boils down to we take exciting stories that I enjoy, you know, and apparently I have decent taste, or at least that's what all of our readers tell me.
You will never take one of my stories.
Yeah, the main thing that we don't take is we don't take Lovecraft stories where people are just name dropping heavies from the mythos. We don't
I'm
take
good there.
D&D-esque stories with we don't really like elves. If you have
Yep, that's where I'm
Dunsanian
screwed.
elves, yeah, if you have elves like from King of Elfland's Daughter, or if you have just like really weird elves like Jack Vance's or Powell Anderson's, we might consider it, but we get stories sometimes from people that's like, here's my adventures of a bisexual dual wielding elf ranger lady. And I'm like,
Okay, well,
no,
that's not my elves.
no.
My elves are elves solely in the fact that elves are a race that exists in my little fantasy world.
And that's fair enough, but
But they're not
we don't
your
really
high
focus
elves.
on high fantasy generally.
Yeah.
Maybe like getting your elf waifus published are gonna have to like happen somewhere else.
Well, I have a sci-fi elf who is an agricultural officer on a deep space freighter.
There you go. But yeah, so we've got a couple of writers in our crew here. And what's fun about this too is I know you talked about it's hard to turn away content that's really good.
Yeah.
And you kind of gave a hint of content that is not so good. Because what happens is sometimes people just get this idea in their head of like, oh yeah, like this is really cool. And you kind of gently want to tell them, it's like, you might want to work on that some more.
We've had a few submissions that were just so explicitly Dungeons and Dragons pastiche. And I've actually told a few writers in our rejection letters, look, some of the things that you're using in this story are actually protected product identity things. Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro have outlined saying that you can't use these or we'll sue you. So you can't call your monsters or whatever things that are part of the Dungeons and Dragons product identity.
Yeah, you can't have beholders flying around. Those are protected.
Hello, Ravensloft. Good to see you. Got our very first chat. But I was gonna say, on that side of it, just for writing structure, what are some of the things you look for when you're judging submissions?
It's got to grab my attention pretty much right away, because if I'm reading over 100 stories, you really got to grab me with something exciting so I have an excuse to spend my time with it. Pacing is important. Decent enough grammar is important. There are some things that we can fix on the editing end, but the less work we have to do, the better.
Absolutely. And then I noticed you also mentioned about the references to like HP Lovecraft name dropping, which I will say I've seen a lot of people say like, hey, my story is Lovecraftian, and I'm just thinking like, okay.
I said that about
No.
the one I'm working on right now.
I mean, I love actual Lovecraftian fiction, but so few stories that label themselves Lovecraftian are remotely Lovecraftian.
It takes more than just like a Cthulhu monster, right?
Yeah, really, really more of what gets called Lovecraftian is the Derlethian. Because I mean that guy, he loved H.P. Lovecraft. He wanted to write those stories, but he was just so bad at it, and he didn't get what made him good.
Yeah. So in that case, tell us what does make him good.
Yeah, just real quick. I think the key to a good Lovecraftian story, where it's not Lovecraftian mythos, but it has those elements, is you've got that constantly creeping dread and kind of a slow spiral into insanity that you as the reader, and usually whoever the main character is, kind of realize is inevitable throughout the course of the story.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is you could say that about all three of our stories that we have for Mark Pellegrini, including the one that's coming up in the spring issue next week. Really, it's about sort of capturing that menace, that existential dread. And if Lovecraft, for his mythos stuff, had just wholesale taken Lord Dunsany's Pagana monsters and gods and not changed any of the names, nobody would talk about him today. He'd just be a forgotten fan writer. But instead, he took the sort of ideas and themes that Dunsany worked with, and eventually he was able to really make them his own and create his own universe out of it. And if you want to do something cool like that, do it with your own stuff. Don't do it with somebody else's.
Exactly.
If you have the talent to write that kind of fiction, write that kind of fiction and make it yours. It's what Lovecraft did.
It's almost like the difference, if I can think of painting, right? Like if you see a really good painting, you may take some of the concepts from it, and then you may say, okay, like in my style palette or my color palette, like I'll include these, but you're not trying to produce a photocopy or a Photoshop version of an existing work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you follow the concept that like every good story has been told, every beautiful painting has already been done, you as a creator in this day and age kind of have to adopt themes, find techniques, pick up strategies, and hone your skill into a Frankenstein's monster that hasn't been seen before, because the combination that you're putting together is somehow new.
Yeah, I mean, think about, cavemen sitting around the campfires telling stories of the mammoth hunts. I mean, they've all been on the mammoth hunts. They all know what's going to happen. It's how well can you tell that story of having hunted and killed the mammoth?
But it's like fishing. Every single one of those cavemen had a bigger mammoth than the other caveman.
Right, but if you're able to make it exciting and be able to put a little bit of a spin on it or tell it in your own way, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's the same story. It's, can you make it your own?
And what I'd like to know, and this is kind of getting into, we're talking about creators, and our podcast is all about people kind of trying to make their own content in different ways. The economics of what you do. you're making your own independent, magazine publication,
Oh, it's
where you're
terrible.
and I was gonna say, because you actually are paying your authors, and that was what was interesting because most magazines that do this kind of thing, like you mentioned, they're usually
Yeah,
like, we'll
they'll pay
send you
like
a free
20,
copy.
maybe
Yeah.
$40 if they're paying it all, or
We'll pay
they
you in
sometimes they pay
exposure.
in. Yeah, no. See,
So a lot of them will ask you to pay them to publish your work. You'll get exposure, so you can front this $120 investment fee.
Yeah, the big problem is there's huge downward pressure on the value of short fiction because there's so much of it out there, but there are so few markets and the readership is relatively small. So publications can pretty much name whatever price they feel like paying and authors will take it. We insist on being good to our authors. We insist on paying them. We pay them upfront on acceptance. We don't make them wait for a check. But we could probably pay whatever we felt like and still get quality stories. That's just not how we want to operate.
Do you retain public, like, copyright? Like, how does the economic, because I can see how value added you are for the author, and that's great. How do you eventually make back your money for making that investment in the author?
Well, the way it works for us is we have 6 months of exclusivity on the stories that we buy, but after that exclusivity, we're able to retain it in print in the original format. Unless something weird happens, like with what happened with last year's issues when we lost our printer distributor for them and just couldn't get them reformatted for our other printers, our titles all stay in print ad infinitum. But we also provide free copy editing essentially for the authors if they want to republish the story elsewhere. So at the end of 6 months, we send them a Word document with their stories, how they were published after they've gone through 3 separate rounds of copy edits, including myself and 2 of our copy editors. So they can use that if they want to put out their own anthology, if they want to do it as a fix-up novel, whatever. So it's still a value add for them, even though we retain limited print rights to it.
So you kind of hold the rights for 6 months just so that they don't give it to you and then send it out for publication in like other markets.
Yeah.
And then after 6 months, they get it back and they can do with it what they will, but you're still allowed to sell and distribute that particular piece forever.
Yeah, so I mean, and we don't sell them individually. We're not putting together like best ofs or anything without prior permission. Like the Kickstarter now that we're doing for combining the 3 parts of the Artomique Paradigm, we've done that by arrangement with the author Michael Tierney. Similarly, with our collections of the Mongoose and Meerkat adventures that we were running 1 per issue. We have an arrangement with Jim Brayfogle that we're publishing collected anthologies of those, and that'll probably be our next one after Wild Stars 5 goes out.
Nice. And then I guess kind of on the business and economic side, like how does it end up shaking out? Is it able to sustain itself? Are you able to derive any income from it? So is it just you sell the print magazine or what else do you do?
Well, we sell the print magazine, we have ebooks, we also have some merchandise. The merchandise is kind of just a really small trickle. We don't get a whole lot of sales on it. I should probably plug it more, but last year was our first year turning a profit. Generally, the magazine is kind of a loss leader for us, and we've been making profit on putting out single author anthologies and novels. So, like, Wild Stars made us money. The Cirsova Classic stuff made us money. Mongoose and Meerkat made us money. The Misha Burnett horror and science fiction stuff that we've put out has made us money. The magazine is a loss leader.
Okay, so it's really through the various like derivative works that it kind of
It balances out a little bit.
balances it out. Yep.
Now, clearly, you're doing it also because it's kind of a passion project for you. The way
definitely.
you're talking about it, it seems like it's more you want this stuff to be in the world, so you're making sure that eventually breaking even or making some money is great, but you're really just kind of driven to keep the content in this format, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Do you find that because you're better to your authors than a lot of other magazines and publications that you're getting better submissions over time, like you're getting a reputation and you're getting I would imagine that you're being so supportive of the authors creates a reputation with authors because they are, a community. You can see it on Twitter where, creators are pretty kind of out there about who's good and who's bad. Does that give you a better selection pool?
I really do think that it does. And I mean, just the fact that we pay semi-pro rates attracts a little bit higher caliber of author. I mean, we had a few award-winning authors who just cold submitted to us that, I mean, they wouldn't normally be in our circles, but I mean, we got stories from them, we liked it, and we ended up publishing them. And when you're getting that quantity too, one of the weird things that I heard from some other slightly more woke publications is the complaint that they weren't getting diverse enough submissions. And I'm like, how? I mean, I'm kind of a right-wing shithead, and I get stuff from women, LGBT. We've published stories from countries all over the world, Greece, India. We've got 2 Romanian authors in our upcoming issue. We published stuff from all over the world.
It's kind of a funny thing too, because I would consider myself pretty right leaning as well. And yet, like, as far as like working with artists and editors and such, like, I've never had an issue with even just like stumbling into like a very diverse team of people that I worked with. I feel like it's, instead of just like putting out the label to say like, hey, like, I'm the guy who does this, it's like, if you just treat everyone nicely, like,
Yeah, I mean,
everybody wants to come to you.
we're known as the magazine for good stories that pays its authors. I mean, that's pretty much where we kind of sit.
Crazy concept.
Tell me about the process of putting it together for publication, because we haven't talked to someone who's worked in
Yes.
kind of
All right. Well,
frequent, like you're doing it more often than a lot of people doing this kind of stuff. So,
all right. Well, from beginning to end, I get all the submissions in. I print them off in the manuscript formats. I make light edits as I'm reading them so that if I end up really liking the story, I've already made a little bit of progress. I dump that into Word. I've got a template format that I use. Once I get everything laid out, I do another round of my own edits. And once I've refreshed myself on the stories, I write lead-ins for them. Then I pass it off to one of our copy editors. He gives me the edits back. I work those in. I pass them off to the next copy editor. I work those edits in. And then I give them back to the authors and say, all right, here's your last chance to make any fixes that we may have missed or anything that you want or need to change. And then I get the files uploaded to the printer, and that's that.
so from start to finish, how long does that process actually take you, would you say? Is this something that I know it might take place over the course of weeks, but in terms of man hours, what do you think you're putting into it between all the copy editors and things like that?
Honestly, I don't know. I haven't really counted it. I'm sure it's a lot.
So clearly what I'm getting at here is that this is where the fact that this is something that you're passionate about is coming into making the product. Even though financially you're probably making a little bit, it's clearly an emotional based investment that you're putting more time into it than you probably are getting back even in the financial reward. And
Easily.
and that's something I do want to point out to creators. We see these stories out there about people who do really well, and that's awesome. But that kind of success doesn't generally happen overnight. You've got to put the effort in probably for a long time where you're maybe breaking even or taking a little bit of a loss while you're working on your craft. And I don't want people to be discouraged on that, because I think you can see the value of putting out a product that is a passion for you. There is a satisfaction just in doing that I can hear in your voice from when you talk about what you make.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it has definitely been a passion project for me. Sometimes it's stressful, but I have gotten a lot of enjoyment out of it over the years.
Nice, nice. And also, now one question I like to ask creators is, for a story that they do, just like, what's one like really like crazy or funny change that they've done to their story? Now, I know you guys have mainly been copy editors. Have you ever run into a case of either a creator like changes the story, or like that there was just like some kind of like really funny editing case that it changed some of the writing?
Generally speaking, no. We
Okay.
have requested a few rewrites at times. It's not very often because generally, if something needs to be rewritten, it's easier to find and buy a story that doesn't. One notable exception was our first story by Christine Lucas that was in issue 4 back in 2016. I'm like, I really like this story, but I feel like it doesn't have an ending. Here's what you could give me. And so she ended up expanding it to about twice the length. And that was the version of the story that we ended up buying for that particular issue.
Okay.
We've had a few other minor changes, like one of the Dreamlord stories. I was like, I liked this, but can we not have the girl die at the end? And he's like, okay. And so he made a few changes to it, and the girl didn't die at the end, and the hero's sidekick got the girl. Hooray!
There you go. You know, what's funny about that is it is one of those cases of for story construction, you can decide that and just say, okay, this is how we would like it to go because we think this is a better story.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, most of the time our edits are light, but in a few cases we have made a few tweaks and changes, but it's not very often.
Yeah, it's always something kind of interesting to see for how some of these happen. But I guess that does make sense because you have so many submissions coming in all the time that it's like,
Yeah, we have so much going on. I don't really have time to act as a developmental editor for stories.
mhm. Although on that note, when you mention developmental editing, have you like separate from this project, have you like done any of that for anyone, or have you ever like coached people on writing?
I've done a little bit of developmental editing. Unfortunately, on one project, it ended up falling through just because one of the other authors that I was trying to involve with it just couldn't get their project together, and I ended up not having the budget for it. But we did work with one of our authors to expand a short story into a novella-length piece, and I hope she ended up doing something with it and publishing it elsewhere because it was a really good story by the time she was done with it.
Just curious, what was it about? If you're allowed to say that.
It was in our 5th issue, the Starthorn Maze. It was kind of a fantasy sword and planet type adventure where this guy and this girl like get tossed into a sort of psionic magic thorn maze that they have to get their way out of.
Oh, I get you. And then all kinds of fun and hilarity ensues from there. And then also too, along with editing these, have you done any writing of your own? So, or any stories of your own?
Yeah, I've done a handful of stories, and a couple of them are actually published in the magazine, and I've got one or two things out on the side. But sadly, editing has taken away a lot from my writing time because I'm kind of a slow writer to begin with, so it's really hard
And
for me to
editing
make
generally
time
takes
for it.
about 4 times as long as writing.
Yeah,
I've
well,
noticed.
No, for sure. And I say that I'm going through editing a comic script right now, and you are absolutely right about that, Joey.
Well, I mean, I wrote probably the first 50,000 words of the book I'm working on here in about a month. I've been editing those same 50,000 words for about 3 months now. So, and that's just kind of my act 1. So I've got a ways to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just wondering if, in terms of your audience that you've been building up, do you see you're probably able to kind of look and hopefully aggregate? Do you see a lot of people like repeat buying? Is it a lot of new customers based on different authors coming in for specific issues? Like what kind of details
got
does
a
that look like that?
we have a small following, but it's pretty loyal. We've got a lot of people who are repeat buyers. We've got people who are fans of some of the series that we've been running, especially Mongoose and Meerkat, that we've been able to finally get to where we're actually putting illustrations in the magazine. So originally we just got a few illustrations for the first collection, but we really liked how they turned out. So we've been having Dark Philly do illustrations for each story as they run in the magazine too.
I know that myself and Joey over there are kind of fans of anime, manga, kind of stuff like that. In that market, there's a big push. There's constantly putting content out. There's a lot of, and it's kind of
Yeah.
magazine based, and so it's an interesting kind of similar to what you're doing, but on a more frequent basis. And they have light novels versus manga. And the light novels, a lot of people don't realize light novels in Japan are actually really big and sometimes sell as much as manga does. And light novels are short stories or ongoing stories where they release a chapter or a little bit at a time with small illustrations. You mentioned adding illustrations to your content. Is that something that you do want to do going forward more often? Like, Is that part of your plan, or was that just something you kind of stumbled into?
It's something that people have always asked for, but illustrations are generally kind of expensive, and since we're already losing money on the magazine anyway, it's tough. But we had a good enough year last year that we were able to start doing more illustrations. So not only do we have Dark Philly doing illustrations for Mongoose and Meerkat this year, she's doing illustrations for Dave Ritzlin's Vran the Chaos Warped novel, and we've got Jesse White, who did John Delaroz's Deus Vult comic, doing illustrations for Orphan of the Shadowy Moons, which is Michael's new Wild Stars novel.
It's pretty awesome. I do think that having that art, especially if you look back at like the pulp history, you know, with the magazines, one of the ways they would always try to draw is that cover art, right? You always want to, even if it's not in the short stories, I can tell from looking at your site and looking, you know, of the previous issues that you're definitely putting the effort into there, which is great. Cause I think that is, from being a comic book fan, it's the covers that always get you in the door, right? It's, you know, you see that and you're like, this is the visual media, even for short stories and magazines or books and novels, that, you know,
they set the tone and expectations, I think.
And I think that
everybody judges a book by its cover. I mean,
Yeah.
whether you realize it or not, if you pick up a book off the shelf and go, oh, that's a shitty cover, the next words out of your mouth aren't going to be, let me take a closer look.
But I think it's funny because modern sci-fi book market makers, they're trying to sell
it's a lazy look.
Yeah, they don't put any effort into it. Like,
they all kind of feel the same after a while.
I've gotten a lot of Bane books in my lifetime, right? I can tell the difference now versus like when I was getting them in the early aughts. And it's like they've developed, like, all right, we've got a library now of book covers we've used in the past. Just copy and paste into the next series that we're doing. And it's like, and it doesn't, I feel like it wouldn't take that much effort to kind of invest in doing that art fresh, right? I know that you mentioned art's expensive, but you're not talking about doing it for every story, every few pages, but put the effort into the cover.
Hey, Mrs. H, we publish adventure fiction, romance, thrilling stories, and sometimes that entails science fiction and fantasy. Often it entails science fiction and fantasy, but we also try not to limit ourselves to that.
And let's mention...
And in the first 5 minutes, he put me in touch with a term I had never heard before. I had to go Google it on the back end, called Sword and Planet, which is a subgenre where usually it's humans as protagonists, but they find themselves on a different planet.
Yeah, I mean, stuff like Star Wars was heavily inspired by the Sword and Planet fiction of the 20s through the 40s.
Nice. And so we've got a couple people watching at least. So let's refresh. Where do they find you onto the interwebs if they want to now order your content or perhaps submit options? You know, let's just refresh on where they would find you.
All right. Well, you can find us on our website, cirsova.wordpress.com. You can find us on Amazon. All of our titles are available through there. Just search Cirsova and we'll turn up.
Sweet. Always like to make sure we're plugging the content creators. Got to take care of everybody who's trying to work hard, because as they've heard so far, this is a labor of love and is not something that is making you a fortune. I know that the guy who did the Wheel of Time just made like 23 million on Kickstarter. And that's awesome. I'm really glad. I don't feel bad for people having success. What I do want to point out is that there's other people too, that if you want to have success, you can support them and look for that kind of thing too. It doesn't have to be either or, but we should also try to help out everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys a lot for having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, the other part of the fun too is it's our first ever stream. So I think it was a great time, great discussion. And yeah, we enjoyed it too.
It was too short. We'll have to get you back on again and maybe just talk about random bullshit. Like when you were talking about how you like Dungeons and Dragons lore, I was like, I wonder if he read any of the books. Has he read Forgotten Realms novels? I want to ask which ones he's read.
I read a bunch of the Dragonlance stuff as a kid.
I want Joey to submit something to you, and I want you to come on here and tell him how his obsession with elves and elf ladies is completely over the top. And
listen, okay, I'm a huge Terry Brooks fan. I read cover to cover why I write about elves. They're not always the main character in my story, but I mean, elves exist in my world setting, so you're gonna run into them.
He's got a problem.
I like pointy ears and cat girls. Okay, it's not a problem.
If
Your other
the-
problem is we like picking on you.
I know, but it's like the little kid video where he's like, I like turtles, and with Joey, it's like, I like elves.
I like turtles too. I have a turtle.
Turtles are awesome. Well, Alex, yeah, I know you said you had to get going pretty soon, so we'll be glad to have you on up until you're ready to go. And I'm trying to think also too, you know it'd be fun actually, in addition to people asking questions through the chat, like we can just straight up like invite people onto the stream with us if we want to.
Well, I would be happy to do it again sometime.
Yeah.
But anyway, you guys have a great night, and thank you again for having me on.
Yeah, Alex, thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, it's been a good time and hope to see you again.
All right, bye.
Thanks.
Okay,
Bye.
Bye.